Andres, would you like to get started or do you want to wait a couple more minutes?
No, I'm fine. We can get started.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your two new published books. I'm excited to get talking with you and some readings. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us this evening. Uh, the structure of tonight's event will first be an introduction. Then we'll have a talk with author Andres C. Salazar, a reading, and lastly, we'll have some time to answer any questions and take comments. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to write them in the chat box or the Q&A. I'll address them there as I can. And at any time, if you have any questions for our author, Andres Salazar, feel free to write it in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll address them at the appropriate time. We're so happy to have you as our next guest in our speaker series, Andres C. Salazar, a Santa Fe-based author who has just released two books, Cibola Spring, a novel, and Siglo, a book of Spanish poetry. Dr. Salazar was born of Hispanic parents in San Juan Pueblo, New Mexico, attended school in Espanola, and graduated from UNM. He has had careers each spanning decades in industry, education, and literature. Among his published work is Seasons, a poetry book selected as a finalist in the New Mexico-Arizona Book Awards in 2016, and released from Cibola, the first book in the Cibola trilogy, a picaresque novel set in northern New Mexico. All right, Dr. Salazar, tell us about your new book, Cibola Spring, which was released last month. Is it the second installment of the Cibola trilogy?
Yes, and first of all, Jessica, I want to thank you and the Santa Fe Public Library for putting on this forum. I think it's great, and I want to thank you for having me participate. To answer your question, yes, the Cibola Spring is the second installment of the Cíbola trilogy, and it's it's a series of novels that tracks Reyes Cordova, who's a boy who's grown up in the Hispanic community or culture in northern New Mexico in the 1950s. He refers to this culture or the community as Cíbola. It's basically a Spanish-speaking community, very land-based, with Pueblo neighbors, rural, Catholic, and prone to mysticism, very family-oriented, and unfortunately rife with poverty. So he has a single mother who speaks only Spanish, and at school he learns English and becomes aware of American norms. The fact that the American culture it's very individualistic, very capitalistic, opportunistic, Protestant, and value-centric. And so the trilogy really tries to tell the story of his coming of age, all the way from being a young boy in this community to embracing American culture. And he has to learn English first, and he's deathly afraid of that as he goes to school. All of this is in the first novel. The second novel now goes on beyond the high school.
Yeah, so the first Cibola book has Reyes Cordova, as you mentioned, the protagonist finishing high school in northern New Mexico, still self-conscious of his English and a pervasive poverty background, as you mentioned. What is Reyes up to in the second book?
Well, the second book of the trilogy deals with Reyes taking the advice of his high school mentors. He's very fortunate in that he's had a good cadre of mentors, teachers who identify with him a little bit, but see that he's capable of going to college. He's got some talent, and they encourage him. And so he's investigated this, and he's checked with his mother, and she's of course not very happy about it because she doesn't even know what college really can bring to her. But this second book continues the two transitions. the one that American culture acclamation for somebody that's growing up in northern New Mexico. And finally, the another one is the escape from poverty. He's tired of being poor. He sees that he has little chance of improving his lot in life by staying in the community. So his teachers have urged him to consider college and seeking an engineering degree. The engineering comes from the fact that, Sputnik had happened in the late 50s. And so science and technology was a big thing back then. And, we were going to join the space program in competition with Russia. So he feels that there's a future there. And his teachers have encouraged him that he can do it. He's willing to try. And in this novel, a new thread is introduced besides the poverty and the Americanization. And the new thread is dealing with college, understanding what college can offer these other transitions, which are important to him. Unfortunately, in going to college, he's handicapped because his family really has very little money or no money at all to support him in college. And there's really no family support. None of the relatives have gone to college. And his mother, like I said, only speaks Spanish. So there really isn't anything that can help him navigate this new saga in his life. In this book, he's shocked when he goes to college that college isn't just education. It's got a battleground for money and power over people and endless ego stroking. So he's concerned about that, and he doesn't know what he's getting himself into. So the novel is really about getting him navigating these troubled waters, these unknowns for him, and he realizes that getting a degree is going to be a struggle for him. It's uh, it's an obstacle course, really, requiring a lot of memorization, a lot of formulas, in the science areas. He's got to follow instructions. But more importantly for him, he's got to maintain a strong resolve to get through this stage. He's got to have unwavering focus, and he's got to control his emotions. And he comes to terms with those obstacles. The theme of the first novel also was one of finding mentors. Since he has only his mother as a parent, he's fortunate in the first novel to find some father figures who help him out, and so he gets through high school, does pretty well, but now in college he again is not with his mother. She plays a minor role, but he's fortunate enough to find other father figures, and there's a neighbor, Senator Senor Ortega, who helps him out, and Professor Coburn and is one of his teachers, and they offer the young lad timely advice and moral support. So that's really a kind of a synopsis of Cibola Spring.
Thank you. You might have touched on this a little bit, but before I ask you for reasons why this third perspective is important to the story, can you summarize the first two themes you treat in the first Cibola book for our audience?
Well, like I said, the first two themes are, how a young lad in northern New Mexico can deal with poverty, realizing that he has very little hope of improving his career there. So poverty is one theme, and the second one is the integration into American culture. Northern New Mexico, Jessica, especially back in the 1950s, was kind of considered to be the counties of Rio Arriba, Taos, Mora, and parts of San Miguel and Santa Fe. And they've been plagued by poverty for decades. Even today, New Mexico has one of the lowest per capita income rates in the country. And northern New Mexico in particular has twice the poverty rate, something like 20% compared to the US rate of about 10%. So the themes have to do with dealing with this background, namely that this part of the country is struggling with those those things. It's still trying to become more Americanized and staving off the factors of poverty. And this is partly because when you look at the history of New Mexico, we were taken over by by General Kearney in 1846, and we had a delay of some 66 years in becoming a state in 1912. And so we as a state didn't integrate into the U.S. Very easily. And we had a lot of Hispanic and Native American subcultures who were holding land for generations, and they weren't really forced to integrate into America. So the state also was primarily rural with very little arable land, and so the farming and ranching that we had really didn't couldn't sustain a larger population. So we lost some of the young people in those days. We had some mineral extraction, but we really didn't have any major industry. Uh, Another factor that was important to understand why poverty and integration to American culture is still something that is important for us to understand is that there was we didn't have compulsory education. It was slow to establish. And George Sanchez wrote a book back in the 1940s, The Forgotten People, and he talks about the fact that here in New Mexico we really weren't helped with an educational system that was required for everybody, so that we could learn English and not just use Spanish and stick to our old ways. And finally, another factor that might explain why we've had poverty and a late integration into America is that we really didn't have a transportation infrastructure. That we had air travel was very late to come to New Mexico. We had very little rail, and the interstate highways didn't come about into the 1950s with Eisenhower. Uh, uh, the other thing I would mention to try to understand these two themes is that Hispanic and Native Americans constituted the overwhelming majority of the population, and we still have a minority infrastructure or population here in the state, but we had this overwhelming majority, and we really didn't have a lot of American settlers until probably in the early 1900s, and that's what really kind of turned the tide, and we finally became a state in 1912. So that's why these first two themes of the first book kind of lays the groundwork for the background of what caused Reyes Cordova to be upset with his lot in life. That he's got to do something to improve it.
Yeah, so like this sort of goes into what led to you adopting the third theme of higher education.
Yes, if you recall, Jessica, we had the GI Bill out of World War II, and the GI Bill was one that was revolutionary in a sense, because uh, all the GIs that had fought in the World War II were eligible to get a college education free of charge, with the government footing the bill. And that started a large influx of students into the colleges. And that happened in the late 40s, but mostly in the 50s and on to the 60s. And this is when Reyes is hitting college as well. So higher education is a very important facet in American history. It's important to understand the workforce development that we had back in the 50s and 60s, and it also helped our race to space with President Kennedy. So this is an important economic and demographic movement in the U.S. that really took hold in the 50s and 60s due to this GI Bill. And Sputnik was the one that really triggered the interest in science and technology, and then the space program under President Kennedy, who was elected in 1960. The 60s was also important because of turmoil that was happening in this country. There was racial and ethnic unrest, for example. Women's rights were spawning a lot of protests. There was an unpopular Vietnam War that really upset a lot of people. There, of course, we had the presidential assassination with Kennedy in 1963. But all these events reached into the college campus. So higher education was an important platform for a lot of things to happen. The racial unrest, the assassination, the Vietnam War, and so forth. The young people were animated, were really struggling to really understand what was going on in the 1960s. So the college theme is one in which for 50 years, you know, the colleges have been growing. The enrollment has just been exploding. And finally, around the year 2000, early 2000s, the U.S. hit a wall. And that we had a lot of dropouts. There were so many students coming to college that perhaps were not prepared, and so dropouts became very dominant. And college education also became expensive. You know, the growth in buildings and so forth led to college budgets being pretty high. So it resulted in higher tuition for students, and all of this has resulted, as you know, Jessica, in that student loans now probably total greater than $1.6 trillion, which is a massive deficit that's been created with this migration to attend college. So college is an important theme. We got to understand it, and I use it as a backdrop for Reyes's uh, message that he thinks that a college education is going to get him out of poverty, and it's going to help him become more Americanized. So Cibola Spring tries to weave these three things together so that it becomes a more interesting and entertaining tale, so to speak.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. It's a lot of important information. Uh, let's see. Aside from Reyes, do you use any other characters from the first book?
Yes, the trilogy is a kind of a mode that writers use to try to weave the characters through the series of books. And Reyes's mother continues to play a role, a relatively minor role, but still an important one. A lot of Reyes's thoughts come about because of his relationship with his mother. And she symbolizes Cíbola of old. She's a daughter of Cíbola. She speaks only Spanish. She knows all the traditions, all the mysticism and so forth, the religion. She's very Catholic and so forth. So she symbolizes Cíbola, and it's hard for him to separate himself from his mother. He's not ready yet. His sister Ida is also seeking an escape route, so to speak, from Cíbola, but she's doing it through marriage. She's thinking of marrying somebody who's American and has a good job and good future, and so she plays a minor role as well. The major role is probably played by Marla Garcia. She's a classmate from Fernandez High, that's in San Isidro, Reyes's hometown, and she's a mystical personality. She plays a very sophisticated foil to Reyes's naivete, and sometimes she mocks his inflexible attitudes, his seriousness, and she's a great counterpart to Reyes. And finally, the role of mentor, which I use extensively in all the novels. I will on all the novels. The mentor is something that we don't appreciate as much, in my mind. But mentors are important beyond our parents. These people can be teachers or people we met. Uh, they were very important in the first book, and in the second book, we have a neighbor, Senor Ortega, who's an elderly person. He's got handicaps. He's cross-eyed. He's hasn't done well with his life, but he's a wizened man, and he's lost his wife, so he's going through terrible agony in losing his wife. And so he encourages, he sees Reyes as himself when he was younger. He tries to help him. There's also a Professor Coburn, who's Reyes's mentor. He's an engineering advisor. And they both contribute to Reyes's building up his confidence and trying to finish the degree. So the characters are, some of them continue, but some of them are, kind of play the same role that's important in the novel series. So so in this book, there is a continuity, but as well there are new characters.
Thank you. I agree. Mentors are vital to our growth. I don't know where I'd be without some of my mentors. Um, let's see. In Release from Cibola, you use short Spanish clips from characters and quotes from some poetic lines. Do you use similar techniques in Cibola Spring?
Yes, I continue that structure. I think that in trying to get across the environment and the culture, you have to use do and think and say, and so there's typical lines of in Spanish that these characters use. His mother's song is in Spanish, or her songs are in Spanish. They stir deep feelings in Reyes. They continue to do that, and again, it's a siren call from this mystical region, Cíbola, and and part of these clips and poetic lines are really part of the ancient traditions that date back hundreds of years in northern New Mexico. There's a lot of art, music, poetry, legends, religious rites, the penitentes, for example, mysticism that is still prevalent in the culture. It was more so back in the 50s and 60s. We've come some way from that, but there are words and phrases that are hard to directly translate into English to portray some of these aspects of the culture. And for those of people who like to know about some of these regional Spanish terms that we use in northern New Mexico, I have a glossary at the end of the novel so that people can see what these words try to imply in English.
That's awesome. Thank you for giving us a glossary. I know I'll need that. Let's see. Why is northern New Mexico the backdrop for Reyes' story? Surely there's other milieus you could have used.
Well, in my years, I've lived in the New York City area for 17 years. 3 years in Florida. I worked for the United Nations in Mexico for a year, and I've seen a lot of success in the assimilation of the Spanish-speaking populations, and they've had advances in art and literature and commerce. The Puerto Ricans, for example, the Cubans in Florida, Mexicans throughout the country, especially in Texas and California. There's 50 million Hispanic people in the United States. It's the largest minority, 17% of our population. And northern New Mexico is a very tiny fraction of that diaspora, if you want to call it that. We number probably, I don't know, less than 1 million in the state, Hispanics. And in northern New Mexico, we're probably around 200, 300,000. But to answer your question, the reason I picked northern New Mexico is that it has a lot of history. It's kind of the cradle of the ill-fated Spanish settlement here in this part of the country back in 1598. And I haven't seen the success level, I think, despite our rich history and culture and so forth, the success level in those fields that I mentioned, especially in literature. Yet, like I said, we have a lot to say and there's a lot to talk about. So my books, I try to form a contribution in a small way to this long overdue tribute to the communities of northern New Mexico. We have like I said, a very vibrant history that's still going on today. So I think it merits a retelling in an informative and entertaining way. And the Cibola trilogy is really an effort to document some of that history.
Thank you so much. Um, so Cibola Spring has several chapters in which Rhea's classmates, Stephen from Hong Kong, Eddie from Nigeria, and Josh from New York, play interesting ethnic roles. What was your intent in creating these characters?
Well, I think college affords a young person an exposure to other cultures, especially when that college has foreign students. And in this case, Coronado State University, where Reyes is attending, is analyzed because they can't speak English very well. They don't know much about America, perhaps, and so forth. Uh, so he, these marginal characters join up with Reyes. There's an affinity there, but it affords Reyes to learn more about the interaction with people in speech and culture and relationships, and some of the history that they bring to the table. So the coming of age story of Reyes wouldn't be complete without appreciating the perspectives that these characters give him, uh, especially since he's gone to a college that has these minority groups. And and language and how they contribute significantly to how these characters think and do and how they view why college is important and so forth. And and unfortunately, some of these factors contribute to what we see in tribalism today in the United States. We associate people with their language or with their religion or something else, their ethnicity, and unfortunately, it drives people apart. But for Reyes, he's trying to understand, what's really the true nature of character in the person, and do away with ethnicity and all the other differences. So I think it's a good coming of age contribution to his development.
I love that. Thank you. Last question about Cibola Spring before I ask you to comment on Siglo, your new poetry book. There are a lot of good books to read out there in the marketplace. Why should someone pick up Cibola Spring at the bookstore or borrow it at the Santa Fe Public Library?
Well, Jessica, as you know, being in the library, there are a tremendous number of good books to read. Just a plethora that we have here in this country. We have a lot of printing presses, a lot of publishers, a lot of good authors. But like I said, very few people have taken the time and effort to write about northern New Mexico. And so if you're really interested in what where we come from, the people here, and why we are the way we are, uh, the people, the struggles with the land and identity and the language and Americanization after 1846, this is a book that you might find interesting. It's a fictionalized setting. It's not a biography or autobiography. It's not really telling the story of a particular person. It's a compendium of a lot of people that I've known, that I've grown up with, or that I've met in my travels or in my work. So in this fictionalized setting, I try to describe a few of the barriers, not all of them certainly, a few of the barriers that this community has had to contend with in trying to assimilate into American society. Uh, as you know, Jessica, in the East Coast, when we had a lot of immigrants coming in from Europe and from other countries, um, there was a need to assimilate pretty quickly because you needed a job. You really didn't have a lot of resources. So the assimilation was accelerated because of that. All these immigrant groups that came through the East Coast. In this case, we were here already. The northern New Mexico settlers had been there for hundreds of years. So we weren't forced to assimilate because we had our land. For example, the Pueblo people had their reservations, and Hispanic people had lands and that they've owned for hundreds of years. So we didn't really have to assimilate. We weren't forced to. And then there were other factors, as I mentioned earlier, that kept us from assimilating. So this is a different kind of subpopulation to write about because we've had a lot of books about the assimilation of these people from Cuba and from Mexico, from Puerto Rico and other Latin American countries, and they're all good books. But about northern New Mexico that really tries a panoramic view. It gives a panoramic view of what we have had to go through. And so Cibola Spring, as the second book in the trilogy, gives you a more personal look into that transition, the transition of people who had been here for a long time and have now been cast into an American culture, and it's a telling of what struggle they've had in trying to become assimilated and really integrated in American culture. So it can be seen as entertaining and at the same time informative. Every time I read a novel, I'd like to learn something about characters, about history, or about something. I don't just want to be entertained. I'd like to have an informative component as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much. So let's move to your next recently published book. Um, and now I'm not bilingual. I'm learning. So please correct
Good.
me when I'm sure say anything incorrect.
Good.
So tell us about your new Spanish poetry book, Siglo, Sueños de Amor y Sombra. Do you consider yourself bilingual? And I have the book here.
Yes. Well, when I get asked that question, it reminds me of an incident back in Mexico City when I was working for the UN. A gentleman came up to me and said, "Do you think in Spanish or do you think in English?" And I thought that to be a very interesting question because in my mind, being bilingual means that you don't think in one language or the other. You just simply think, and then you use the language to express what thought you have. Anyway, Siglo is a poetry book that's written in Spanish. It follows an earlier work, Seasons, that was written in English. It's the two of them are not connected in any way. Uh, it's called Siglo because there are 100 poems in there. 50 of them are dedicated to love, love being, in my mind, one of the most powerful motivation for guiding our life. And love takes many forms. It could be amorous love. It could be love of a place, of a parent, of a number of things. And then 50 are dedicated to what I call sombra. And in Spanish, it kind of denotes a dark side of things. And this could be fear, for example, or evil, a nightmare. And so these poems try to describe, how a Spanish-speaking person looks at these two diverse emotions that are very important in our lives. If we have fear of something, it kind of dominates our actions, our thoughts. We have love, everybody knows that, especially amorous love, it can dominate, a lot of things that we do and say. Some of the poems are fanciful, some of them are foreboding, some tell stories, some just feature the lyrical sense of the Spanish language. I love to write in Spanish because it's there's just a sound to the language, and and you can put words together, and they really sound, very very entertaining, very musical in a sense.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So, Professor Salazar, we have a little bit extra time. Do you mind sharing with us a couple of short passages from your novel Cibola Spring and maybe a couple of poems from the poetry book Siglo? Then we can turn it over to the audience for questions.
Okay, good. Well, let me see if I can share screen with you.
Sure.
Let me try to find it.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. Is it showing up?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. Well, the first one is out of Cibola Spring, so you might have the book. In this case, Reyes goes to a Sunday mass in Old Town Albuquerque, and as you might know, Jessica, Old Town Albuquerque is a kind of a remnant of a very Hispanic community there. There's an old church, San Felipe de Neri. I use it as a backdrop. Uh, he's waiting for his cousin Claudia, who's recovering from an abortion, and so he's kind of wasting time, and he wastes time by going to church. And so this passage talks about him seeing that he's still part of this culture, and he sees that even in Albuquerque, which is not northern New Mexico really, but there is a little community there that reminds him of Cíbola. He was the youngest person there in the church, founded in the early 1700s. Its benches today were lightly occupied with folks who held opened, dog-eared prayer books in their hands or prayed the rosary, their lips barely moving as they followed the mass with their eyes. Men in attendance, most of them white-haired and emaciated, were bent over and wore overly large denim work shirts or a light jacket. A few had laid their walking canes beside them and did not kneel during the service. They arose slowly for communion, grimacing as they used their canes skillfully to make their way to the altar and through their remaining life. Hollow-eyed women had faces ravaged with lines and age spots, made uglier by bandanas tightly wrapped around their heads instead of bearing stylish hats. Church. The appearance of the faithful at the Mass spoke volumes about the condition of the residents of Old Town. It was a cityfied version of the Cíbola generation in a late fall or early winter season, confused and whiplashed by the high winds of the storm called Americana on a disappearing culture. So the second passage is on page 130, and Reyes is talking to his neighbor, Senor Ortega, who's really become a mentor to Reyes, as I mentioned before. He's having dinner with him, and the older gentleman is fighting his own demons, as I've said earlier, but he identifies with Reyes in his youth. He thought he was going to have a very successful life, and he's lost his wife. He's very very sad, and know that Reyes found difficulty in with the college environment and the discrimination that he may face from non-Hispanic faculty. And he knows this because he works at the college. He's seen some of this before. And this is a very harsh statement for this gentleman. he very harshly describes this problem in a historical and worldly perspective for Reyes. He's trying to shock Reyes into understanding that there's a big problem here. So this is what he says. My father, Casimiro, was half Pueblo Indian. He had the usual problems of being a half-breed, language problems of trying to master Spanish, Tegua, and English, dark features with high cheekbones, absent father as well. He worked construction jobs in Santa Fe and became a good carpenter, but the pay was spotty. So my mother took in ironing and worked as a maid for well-to-do American transplants, gallery owners, artist wannabes, trust fund babies, and retired folk from back east. They had us, whether or better. We are strangers to them, not the other way around. We are to be colonized in the American way. They like our exotic nature, buy our jewelry, take in the Spanish traditions, but they still retain that superior nature. Suppressed in polite company, but never really integrating. Those with malice find fault with what we do. Our sins are somehow bigger or worse than theirs. It's not any different here than in the rest of the world. There are colonizers and the colonized. Maybe it's human to seek privilege. As Indians, we looked at the Spanish seeking superiority, the search for Hidalgo, not just the gold glitter. Now it's the Americans' turn. There is need to secure privilege and lock it up so it can't be taken away. So here's a couple of poems from Siglo. The first one is concerns probably amorous love is the best genre for it. It's a pair of young lovers out for a summer stroll, and they're pausing beneath a shady pine tree. Now, the young gentleman has amorous intentions, but the young lady is more forward-looking. Bajo pino veo. Tomé su mano en el verano cuando lirios cantan a la vez. Llegamos a una selva atarantados del olor penetrante. Tuvimos que descansar. Nos paramos por un momento echando bella sombra. Estuvo todo en sincronía, esperando señal de ternura. Parecía que era tiempo de hablar de compromiso. No me acuerdo quién habló primero. De enredos y promesas de gran nivel. De días y hablar. Y habiendo oído de los que castigan, yo estaba admirando rostro y cabello, gozando de su aura perfumada, probando la idea de tocar, pues perdido en lo sensual. Now this next stanza is the lady talking back to the gentleman after his thoughts. Señor, me grito por sí. Dígame de dónde viene su pedida y cómo te parece la fecha fija y el modo de la boda y hogar. So she's got wedding in her mind. And so he thinks back and he's troubled by what she says. Asustado del respiro y cariño abrazado, habíamos empezado el murmuro, mi sentido palpitando sin parar, echados al suelo bajo pino suelto, despierto ya con labor y garganta seca. Hablé de mi sueño, realmente de ser hidalgo con rancho amplio, aunque sea solo sin familiares. Seguí algo tartamudo, todavía acostado. Es mi destino negarme nunca. Detalles no los tengo precisamente. La carrera se devuelve en la busca. cierto del sentido que me guía. Se levantó la moza, algo enojada, ajustó sus naguas y habló sinceramente. Entiendo que los sueños no cuestan nada. Su porvenir es un dibujo en realidad. Quiero vida mejor de mis padres. Mis hijos serán los flores de mis tareas. Disculpe que mi cariño tenga más valor que un placer bajo pino veo. El enojo no es serio. Y ahora pudiéramos continuar el deseo natural en día tan bonito. Tomé su mano como caballero. Le di mis ojos que entendían lo grave que era un beso y el enganche de un abrazo. Se sentó la señorita, dándome la sonrisa de permiso. Me besó como loca. Su lengua me... De ese punto no sé qué sucedió. Me acuerdo del regreso a su casa. Los lirios seguían en su canto. Todo se olía más dulce, sintiendo ropa llena de agujas de un pino compañero. No le pregunté detalles. So he's taken this affront from the lady, and so he just wants to get back, and he senses that it is serious, and so she kisses him, and he forgets what happened afterwards. The last poem is kind of a more somber poem. It's about a man who's lost his wife, and he's sitting there at the funeral, burying her. And as is a Hispanic tradition, there's a lot of people who come to funerals. It's something you don't want to miss if you're part of the family. You don't want to miss it if you're a friend of either the deceased or the family. So it's a very big event. And he's this gentleman is thinking there about his life with he imagines what might happen afterwards now, and he wonders what's going to become of him. So this scene is kind of similar to a lot of literature that talks about death and what happens to us when something big affecting our lives happen to us. So in that vein, this poem is written. La escena del entierro. El sacerdote acaba de rezar. Nos persigamos otra vez. El coro empieza a llorar. Otro canto del día tan oscuro. Me prometí que mis ojos no iban a mojarse. Quería ver muy claro la escena del entierro. El abrazo de cada amigo que hizo caso de alabarla tu risa, fama y amistad. Uno por uno hay recuerdo de la ocasión cuando ponías atención a queja o herida. Me dicen que no pueden olvidar la fuente del cariño que calmaba el dolor. No hay remedio de ausencia tuya. Los hijos ofrecen lo que pueden, sus vidas llenas de compromiso y familia. Es mejor seguir camino solo y tranquilo. Tengo tesoro de recuerdos de nuestro tiempo, la pasión, viajes, hijos que dan orgullo como pena, el idioma de apoyo que usamos con una voz para engrandecer amor y la herencia. Pero no te niego que tengo miedo del cambio y riesgo de estar solo. Espero que los huesos duelan más. El sueño no me alcance como antes. Mi doctor estará listo con píldoras. Los nietos dirán chistes para compartir sonrisa. Seguro que los amigos ofrezcan cerveza. Viudas vendrán con soborno de baile o teatro. Hay dolor de amor. Me dejas en invierno de la vida. Me pones alma en prisión. no se pueda borrar vida tan feliz. ¿Habrá espacio para empezar de nuevo? This last poem is about an older gentleman who's receiving a pension or receiving money every once in a while, and he's a very poor man, and he lives on this pension, and he's going to go out and to market to buy a few groceries, but he sees these kids playing in his in the playground near his home, and he feels sorry for them. It's called La Merced de Dios. Mis chavos llegaron hoy con alegría y fui por provisiones de un pobre. El viaje era corto sin problema, dando que gasté el bolsillo pronto. En mi regreso encontré plebe de vecinos, flacos de lidiar con miseria. El mando no dejaba pedir limosna. Sus ojos no escondían hambre. Hacía calorcito del mediodía. Todos días a descansar. Lento era el vuelo del gorrión. No pude escapar la merced de Dios. Llamé a los chamacos algo lejos, a sus cantos de un obedientes se acercaron rápido a dar algo. Estaban descalzos ese día y pensé de mis compras pocas, los granos de maíz y lentejas rojas, la carne seca y chile verdecito. Los inocentes no ven daño ni dolor. Confundidos se miran uno al otro. Aquí les regalo estos comestibles. Díganle a sus padres que me sobran. Los chicos a la dirección de sus padres. Era santa hora del almuerzo, pero mi hambre se había huido. So he buys these groceries and he feels sorry for the kids and he gives away the groceries. He calls them and they think that he's in trouble, but he's not in trouble. He simply wanted to give away the groceries. And they run because they're obviously hungry. And the last line, he's saying, it's the holy hour of breakfast, but my hunger somehow has vanished. So it's a case where religiosity, religion is very much a factor in Hispanic cultures. And you try to give away, even though you're poor, you want to help out those that have less than you do. Okay.
Thank you so much. It's beautiful.
Sure.
We can open it up to questions if anyone has any. Victor Lawrence, I see your hand is raised. I'm going to allow you to talk if you have a question.
Thank you so much. I am one of the mentees of Andy Salazar, so I am very pleased to see these accomplishments of his. Andy, congratulations.
Thank you.
Now,
Thank
I
you.
wanted to know the difference between northern and southern New Mexico. Is there a big difference? And has the gap changed in the
Well,
in the 2000 yeah?
Well, in the in the early settlement, the Spanish settlers who came here under Oñate, they brought back traditions and beliefs from Spain, and one of them was that when you have a confluence of rivers, and in northern New Mexico you have the Chama River and the Rio Norte, which is now called the Rio Grande, but back then it was called Rio Norte. And so the Spanish thought that this confluence area was magical. It was something that they couldn't ignore, and it was in the middle of all these pueblos that were reputed to have gold and riches, which is something they were told not to seek, that they were simply settlers. They wanted to expand the reach of Spain in those days, so they settled a lot in Latin America. But here in New Mexico, they came to this region, which is kind of in the northern part of the current state. And they saw this confluence of rivers that they thought magical. So they asked the Indians there that they met, and they named the pueblo San Juan Pueblo de los Caballeros. They asked if they could establish a settlement at the confluence, and the Pueblo Indians told them, yeah, go ahead. There's an old pueblo there that we abandoned a long time ago. If you want to go ahead, go ahead and go there. And so the settlers did go there. Anyway, it's the cradle of settlement by the Spanish here in New Mexico. So that's what, and there's still people living there. There's a little town called Chamita, my mother was from, which is really the modern version of San Gabriel, which was at first settlement. And so northern New Mexico has this continuity of settlement, of continuous occupation by people who speak Spanish, and of course there's the Pueblo Indians as well. But in the mainland of North America, it's the northernmost settlement that has been continuously occupied. I mean, you might argue that 12 years of the Spanish Revolt, sent them back south, but they came back. So in Florida, you have the settlement of St. Augustine. That has been continuously settled, but it's a coastal city. It was much easier to travel there and leave and go back to Spain. This is an inland settlement, and it's the oldest continuously lived in settlement by Europeans in North America. So to show the contrast, the southern part of New Mexico was considered mostly desert. In fact, there's lots of stories written about crossing that desert to get to the north. So it took a longer time to settle the southern part of the state. It's not as old in terms of missions and a lot of establishments. Of course, there are pueblos there, but the European settlements did not really take hold in the southern part of the state as much as they did in the north.
Thank you. Robert asks, are you able to indicate how close the experience of Reyes approached those of Andres, you as a young man?
Well, as I said earlier, any author will admit that any novel that he or she writes is based on experiences of their own, their imagination and people they've known and so forth. And there are certain elements certainly that are mine. I've experienced them and I kind of embellished them or rewritten them or made them better or made them worse. So there is some basis for Reyes's experiences that are based on my life, on things that I've seen. But there are many, many more that are different. Some of them are worse than my life, and some of them are a lot better that I didn't suffer as much as Reyes is suffering in this series of novels. So any author who says that it's not based on anything that he's ever experienced or she's ever experienced is probably lying to you. It's based on something that we have seen, that we have interpolated, that we have extrapolated, that we've somehow embellished or made worse or better.
Yeah, thank you. We have several people thanking you for your wise teaching through your storytelling. Thank you, Professor Salazar. I appreciate your discussion on the role of mentors. They are so important, especially to those that are first in their families to attend college. I see Pete Herrera, you have your hand raised, so I'm going to allow you to talk if you have a question. Make sure to unmute yourself. Pete Herrera, if you can hear me, I've allowed you to talk and ask your question, but you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Does that work?
Yes.
Oh yeah, there you are.
Okay. Good evening, Andres. I've really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I grew up in Chamita.
Good.
My mom's maiden name was Salazar, so I suspect you and I may very well be related.
Very well could be.
I think you were probably a couple of years ahead of me at Espanola High School. I graduated in '63, and as I recall, you graduated in '61, if that's correct.
Yeah, 1960.
I'm really looking 1960. I'm really looking forward to. I have not read either one of your books, but I'm certainly going to obtain them, and I'm looking forward to reading about them. I was curious when you started your presentation talking about learning Spanish first, as so many of us did when we were growing up back then, and I've always kind of considered that as actually a big plus that we learned Spanish at home and then learned English when we went to, either San Juan Parochial or as I did, or San Juan Public School, because we became bilingual almost, I'm not sure how to say it, but just automatically. And I think that is part of what our culture has lost future generations, is that so many of us or grew up saying, well, my kids or my grandkids are going to learn English first so they can assimilate better, I guess. But the question I had was, and as I said, I haven't read your books, but do the 1950s and early 60s, when we were growing up and we were in elementary school and then into high school, do you deal in your books with the influence of what was going on at Los Alamos during the 1950s, and then also with the arrival of the Vietnam War, how so many of the kids that could not afford, the Hispanic kids who could not afford to go to college, ended up being drafted into Vietnam, and the role that they played, obviously, in that war. Anyway.
Yep. Okay. First of all, the Spanish question has to do with kind of the fact that there is an advantage to learning one language and then learning another later, especially when you have the formative years.
Right.
Research has shown that the earlier you learn a language, the more it'll stay with you, and that's the advantage that we've had in terms of learning Spanish earlier. And like I said, I got that comment from a gentleman in Mexico City about the Spanish that I was using with him. Anyway, getting back to whether it's an advantage or disadvantage, I got the sense that that's what you're really asking. Certainly, it's an advantage in terms of culture, and also being able to work with people in Latin America, for example, or in Spain. But it was thought of to be a disadvantage back then in the 50s and 60s, and it is today, even with the recent Mexican immigrants that we have in our state. That if you don't know English, you're thought of as being kind of dumb or not really with it, or uneducated, and it's curious to me that we don't think of that with a lot of other language speakers. In fact, British people who can't take up the American accent, for example, we don't criticize them as being dumb or anything. So it is curious how American culture has come to be, that looks at Spanish as being somehow, a Spanish speaker as being not with it or not educated, simply because we have an accent, and we don't know English as well as they do. So that's what Reyes is struggling with, and that's one of the main themes in the book. And his teachers have told him that if you don't know English, you're not going to get very far.
Mm.
That English is not only important for learning other trades by reading books in English that are numerous, going to school in college, you can certainly digest the matter that's being taught to you much more easily if you know English. And this is true for foreign students as well. When they come to this country and they go to an English speaking class in anything, in science or technology or any subject, the less English you know, the worst time they're going to have. So mastering English was, even though it was difficult because we had spoken Spanish for so long that it was hard to enunciate English correctly, a la American way. It was a burden. It was a disadvantage, and that's what this book talks about. But you're right in that having two languages has always been a cultural plus. It helped me in working at the United Nations, like I said before. It's helped me in talking to people who are somehow disadvantaged and are Spanish speakers. So it's helped me a lot in my life, and I appreciate that. But in terms of earning a living in the United States, especially in the 50s and 60s, it was really a handicap.
I agree, and I also have my career was as a journalist, and having the ability to speak Spanish and English really was very advantageous. And I just I've always been very grateful to my parents for having taught. My mother only spoke Spanish. My dad was spoke both, and
Good.
I'm always grateful that I got to learn Spanish when I was, growing up before I even went to first grade, because it is something that has always helped me. I have to tell you, it was very interesting what you mentioned about the gentleman in Mexico City who asked you, do you think in Spanish? And whenever I go back up to Espanola in the valley, I think I believe, I know I use much more Spanish, and I think I really do think in Spanish when I'm up there.
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, for what that's worth.
Good. Okay.
But thanks again for your work.
Sure. Thank you.
Andres, do you have time for one more question? And then I'll let our audience know about where they can get a copy of your book. So Melissa asked, Dr. Andres, you had a career as a poet later in life. Did you ever feel encouraged in college to write poetry, or was engineering the only focus there?
Well, anybody who's written poetry will tell you that they've written poetry their whole life. It's something that becomes an interest early on in life. The magical things that you can do with words, putting them together, making them sound a certain way, express a thought, that sort of thing. So I'm not sure that I would agree that it's late in life. Some of these poems that I've published, both in the Seasons book, which is back in a few years ago, and the one that's just published, some of those poems were written many, many years ago, perhaps 10, 20 years ago. And some of them are recent, but it's a continuous journey that we all follow if you're really into language, and poetry is one expression of that language. And writing in English and writing in Spanish is kind of a very interesting thing, because you take elements that other poets in English have written. For example, you take elements of the Spanish poets from Spain or Latin America. You integrate them into your own style. The subjects become similar. We all go to funerals, for example, the poem that I just wrote, that I just read to you. We all have, we feel sorry for children who are hungry. So that's a common element, but we all express our feelings towards that instance differently. And each language has its pluses and minuses in expressing those thoughts. So to answer your question, engineering is a very a precise, like all sciences or technologies, look on precision. You want certain things to be right. And anybody in literature, especially poetry, will tell you that they have written and rewritten and novelist as well. Hemingway said he wrote for 34 times the ending of some of his novels, and they asked him why. Why weren't you satisfied with the second or the third time? He says, I had to get it right. So a poet will tell you, just like an engineer would, that you got to do it right. In an engineer, you're jeopardizing the safety of other people, for example. In poetry, you want to make sure that the language is the best that you can muster in expressing that thought. So there's some similarities, and people have written about the fact that science and literature are not that far apart in terms of people's desire to do things, to create things. Creativity is certainly a common element for both professions. So I don't see it as being different. This comment about late in life, well, you don't suddenly start writing poetry. You've been writing poetry, all your life. You've thrown a lot of those away because they just didn't sound right or didn't express what you wanted. So you're left with those that you think are worth keeping, worth publishing, and sharing with others. And that's what these poetry books that I've written, they're just excerpts of many other poems that I've thought about and written, and perhaps these are, in my mind, the best that I could do.
Thank you so much, Andres, Dr. Salazar. And thank you everyone for being here with us this evening and to hear Dr. Salazar's storytelling and really important history involved in that. We can learn a lot through Dr. Salazar's books. So Dr. Salazar has generously donated copies of both of his new books to Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library. So anyone interested, book groups interested, can make a suggested donation of $10 to the Friends and receive a copy of these titles. They'll be signed as well. So we have limited copies of those available, so be sure to email us. I put the email there in the chat box, but you can email library@santafenm.gov if you're interested in that. You may also find his books online just by searching his name, Cibola Springs or Siglo and Andres Salazar. You'll find multiple vendors where you can purchase copies, and we'll have them available on our catalog very soon for checkout. Be sure to check out Santa Fe Library calendar for more upcoming virtual events. And we can't thank you enough for you sharing your time with us and wisdom. Thank you so much, Andres.
Sure, my pleasure. And thank you for having this series, this author series. Thank you.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, read books, and have a great evening. Good night.
Good night.